Now that we've reviewed the presidencies of George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, we're going to take a look at the presidency of James Madison, but in particular we're going to focus on the War of 1812. And most of Madison's presidency, his very first term, he was dealing with the backlash from Jefferson's Embargo Act and all of the things that very slowly caused us to decide to enter into this war. And then his second term, he had to deal with actually fighting the war and coming to some kind of conclusion and a peace treaty. So although we will talk a little bit about some of his domestic policy, most of this is going to be about his foreign policy. At his inauguration, James Madison, a small, wizened man, appeared old and worn. Washington Irving described him as but a withered little Applejohn. He was very bookish, and like Jefferson, he was a poor speaker. But whatever his deficiencies in charm, his wife Dolly compensated for them with her warmth and her gaiety. She was the toast of Washington. Born in 1751, Madison was brought up in Orange County, Virginia, and attended Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey. He was a student of history and government, well-read in the law, and he participated in the framing of the Virginia Constitution in 1776, served in the Continental Congress despite his small frame, and was a leader in the Virginia Assembly. James Madison was a Democratic Republican who entered office at a rather unfortunate time, as he was left to pick up the pieces of Jefferson's economic and foreign policies after Thomas Jefferson happily left what he called the splendid misery of the highest office. In the presidential election of 1808, the Democratic-Republican candidate, James Madison, of course defeated the Federalist candidate, Charles Pinckney, and Madison had served as the Secretary of State under the incumbent Thomas Jefferson, while Pinckney had been the unsuccessful Federalist candidate in the election of 1804. Sitting Vice President George Clinton, who had served under Jefferson, was also a candidate for president, and he garnered 6 electoral votes from a wing of the Democratic-Republican Party that really didn't approve of James Madison. And this election was the first of only 2 instances in American history in which a new president would be selected, but the incumbent vice president would continue to serve. And the other instance of this, if you're interested, is the re-election of John C. Calhoun in 1828. When it comes to James Madison's domestic policies, I think it's important to remember that Congress in this particular time period was different than ever before. It was composed of a younger generation of men who ousted the older generation into submission. And these young congressmen, especially from the West and the South, were incredibly fiery-tempered and were called war hawks because they often pushed for war. And the 2 most famous examples that are shown here in their older age are Henry Clay, who was a young man from Kentucky, and he was named Speaker of the House at age 34. And then John C. Calhoun was a representative from South Carolina in his earlier years. At the same time that we have this pro-war sentiment building in Congress, we also have the growth of a pan-Indian movement under Tecumseh, who we talked about in our previous lecture. And Tecumseh is a Shawnee warrior, and his brother was known as the Prophet. They were the leaders of the Native American opposition to the War Hawks, and they had the support of the British, of course. In 1805, Tecumseh's younger brother had experienced a series of visions that transformed him into an incredibly prominent religious leader, and they went around preaching this sort of nativist revitalization and urged a cultural renewal through the first pan-Indian movement. And what Tecumseh did was he very astutely began to transform his brother's religious following into a political movement, and he set up a new settlement called Prophetstown at the juncture of Tippecanoe and the Wabash River, and he began traveling throughout the Midwest urging tribes to form a political confederacy to prevent any further erosion of native lands. At this point, many white Americans viewed Native Americans as presenting a serious threat to American pioneers, and this was especially true of these war hawks in Congress. Kentucky, which most Native tribes had considered a kind of hunting reserve and a buffer zone, was now filled with white settlers who these Native Americans believed were encroaching upon their territory. So these war hawks wanted the Native Americans cleared out of the West, and the forces of Tecumseh really strike fear into the frontier settlers, and the war hawks in Congress became convinced that the British were financing the Indian Alliance from Canada, and they were already incensed over the British orders in council and impressment, so the assumed British support of Tecumseh pushed the war hawks to an even greater height of fervor. So in November of 1811, while Tecumseh was in the South trying to recruit the Creeks in his new Confederacy, U.S. forces, with the approval of Congress, marched against Prophetstown in what's known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. They were led by General William Henry Harrison, who was appointed the governor of Indiana Territory by Thomas Jefferson, and they defeated the Prophet, burned Prophetstown down, and destroyed their food and supplies. And Tecumseh wasn't injured during this battle because he was absent, so when he came back, he tried to rebuild his shattered Confederacy, and he withdrew to Michigan during the War of 1812, where he assisted the British in capturing Detroit, and he led pro-British natives in action against the United States. When William Henry Harrison eventually invaded Upper Canada, he killed Tecumseh in the Battle of Thames in 1813. In order to really understand James Madison's foreign policy and the development of the War of 1812, we have to look a bit at the background that occurred in the years prior to Madison taking office. It was in the year 1803 that Napoleon plunged Europe into war. It was right after the French Revolution when he took over the country as essentially a dictator and then began this sort of imperialistic impulse to go out and conquer nearby territories. Now, for the United States, this was good news economically speaking because it meant that the U.S. could trade with either side in the war, either with the British or with the French, and they could sell them any of the things they needed and they could make money all the while. Now, America's free reign of the sea was pretty short-lived, though. In 1805, British Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson's fleet won at the Battle of Trafalgar, and this ensured that Britain ruled the seas. Now, Napoleon and the French won at the Battle of Austerlitz, and it ensured that France ruled the land. Now, these events really had nothing to do with the United States until in 1806, London issued what are called the Orders in Council, and these rules stated that any foreign or U.S. ship that was headed to France had to first check in at a British port for inspection. And likewise, France announced that they'd seize any foreign ships entering into British ports. And of course, America was stuck in the middle. And just to address the question, how can they tell us what to do? The answer is that their navy is stronger than the American Navy. The issue of impressment, which means kidnapping at sea, was even more troublesome for many Americans. There were about 6,000 American sailors who were impressed, and often the British would board their ship, they would find them in cities, sometimes in ports. They would knock them out with a club, and when they awoke, they were on a British ship working as the lowest class of seamen. This issue of impressment really boiled over in the year 1807, in which there was a naval engagement known as the Chesapeake Leopard Affair that occurred off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. And this was in June, on June 22nd to be specific, and it was between the British warship, the HMS Leopard, and the American frigate, the USS Chesapeake, when the crew of the Leopard pursued and attacked and boarded the American frigate looking for deserters from the Royal Navy. The Chesapeake was caught unprepared, and after a very short battle involving broadsides from the Leopard, her commander, named James Barron, surrendered his vessel to the British after firing only a single shot. And 4 crew members were removed from the American vessel and were tried for desertion, one of whom was subsequently hanged. And then the Chesapeake was allowed to return home, where James Barron was court-martialed and suspended from command. The Chesapeake Leopard affair really created this uproar among Americans and much more strident calls for war with Great Britain, but these quickly subsided. And it was during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson initially attempted to use this widespread desire to diplomatically threaten the British government into settling the matter. The United States Congress really backed away from armed conflict when British envoys showed no real contrition for the Chesapeake affair and delivered proclamations reaffirming impressment. So Jefferson's political failure to coerce Great Britain led him to economic warfare in the embargo of 1807. Thomas Jefferson believed that a shipping clash and a war with England and/or France was coming, and that the only way to avoid this would be to impose an embargo and to put a halt on all exports. He mistakenly didn't see the impact that this kind of a shutdown would have on American merchants, and in 1807 the Embargo Act was passed, and it forbade all exports to any nation, whether they were at war or not. New England was probably hit the hardest by the act, as ships simply sat dormant in the harbors as the merchants went broke. The South and the West were also hurt, though to a lesser degree as their crops started to pile up. And not surprisingly, smuggling returned once again, and this time things were smuggled out of the country instead of into the country. In 1809, due to all of the protest, and seeing that the results of this Embargo Act on trade were incredibly negative, Congress went in and repealed the Embargo Act. And their logic was, why limit all trade when it's just England and France that we're worried about? So Congress passes the Non-Intercourse Act, and they outlawed shipping to England and France only, thinking that this will help bring the economy back. But while this new act looks good on paper, in reality, it's kind of silly. It has the same effect as the Embargo Act because America's number 1 and number 2 trade partners were Britain and France. Overall, clearly, this embargo and the Non-Intercourse Act were not successful. They failed due to the excessive smuggling and to the fact that the British relied on America much less than Jefferson had thought they would. And essentially, the Embargo Act hurt America without doing much good. With the money that was lost, the United States could have built a strong navy that might have dealt with the British Navy on equal terms. There were some unexpected benefits to the embargo, though. It forced American industry to get going on its own, and ironically, this helped Jefferson's archenemy, Alexander Hamilton, who'd envisioned an industrial America rather than an agrarian one. So it's at this point in history that James Madison steps into office officially as the president, and you can imagine how overwhelmed he must have felt with stepping into what was essentially a crap storm, where the Embargo Act in 1807 had failed, the Non-Intercourse Act was also failing, and the relationship between America, Britain, and France was deteriorating rapidly. It's at this point in May of 1810 that Macon's Bill No. 2 becomes a law, and Macon's bill was intended to motivate Great Britain and France to stop seizing American vessels. It was a revision of the original bill that was written by Nathaniel Bacon, known as Macon's Bill No. 1, and the law lifted all embargoes with Britain and France for a 3-month period. If either one of the two countries ceased attacks upon American shipping, the United States would end trade with the other, unless that other country also agreed to recognize the rights of neutral American ships. Napoleon very quickly saw a chance to exploit Macon's bill in order to further his Continental Plan, and the Continental Plan was a form of economic warfare that he believed would destroy Britain's economy. So he sent a message to the United States, and he claimed that the right of American merchant ships as neutral carriers would be recognized by France. And President James Madison, who had been a staunch opponent of the bill, didn't necessarily fully trust Napoleon, but he grudgingly accepted the offer. But he probably should have stuck with his gut, because Napoleon had no intention of ever following through on his promise, and Madison very quickly realized this and ignored the French promise. The British were still very offended by the agreement and threatened force, and they motivated Napoleon to withdraw altogether. So the damage had been done at this point, and soon the United States and Britain were entangled in the War of 1812 due to the continued harassment of American ships and the escalated tension between the U.S. and the nations of Europe. Now, a general consensus among historians is that Macon's Bill No. 2 was effectively useless, as it was quickly seen that the European economies played upon the weaknesses that the bill created, and as a result, the bill's parameters were never enforced due to Madison's correct interpretation of France's deviation from Macon's bill. So if we look at a list of the various reasons for the War of 1812, there are 5 that really stand out. The first would be a desire for freedom of the seas. The United States wanted the right to sail and to trade without fear, and they were sick of the impressment of American soldiers. The second would be the possibility of gaining land, the idea that if the United States won, they might gain Canada or Florida. The third would be the economy, that those in the South and the West really blamed Britain for causing a depression by closing the trade, and they wanted to fix this economy. The fourth would be a desire to resolve Native American issues, and many Americans were upset because they believed, in some cases rightfully so, that British guns were being given to the natives. And in fact, this is really why the Battle of Fallen Timbers is fought in the War of 1812. And they believed that this giving the guns to the natives was causing native attacks on the frontier. And then the final reason for the War of 1812, on a theoretical level, fighting and defeating England would make a major statement. America would have to be considered as an equal amongst other nations, rather than just this scrawny upstart that may or may not survive. And this is why it's often called the Second War for American Independence. War hawks argued that war with Britain would drive the British out of Canada, and it would make the frontier safer for Western settlers. Losses at sea and national pride and desire to make the frontier safe were cause enough to make James Madison forget about his desire for neutrality and declare war. Generally speaking, before a nation goes to war, they need 3 things. They need support, supplies, and allies. And America before the War of 1812 had none of these. They had a small army with state militias that only fought in their own states. They needed money in order to build up the army and supply the army and to build up a navy, but the National Bank's 20-year charter had just run out, and the Embargo Act had destroyed their economy, so there was no money to be found. In addition, there were regional divisions, and New Englanders really disliked the war. They were very much pro-British, as they disliked the French, and New England merchants, because of their ability to smuggle, were still profitable before the war. It wasn't a dire experience for them where they absolutely needed to go to war. The New England merchants also worried that if they were able to acquire Canada, this would add a number of agrarian states, which was what Thomas Jefferson wanted, and the people living in New England, the merchants, were often Federalists, so they didn't want a bunch of Democratic Republican farmers to join the nation. In fact, many of these New England merchants sent supplies to the British to help them invade New York from Canada, and these New England investors ended up lending more money to England than to the United States. Overall, the War of 1812 was America's worst fought major war. The United States only managed to win the war because of some fortunate circumstances. Britain at this point was focused on France and Napoleon, and so it didn't commit all of its resources to the United States. And in the end, there was no real decisive victory for either side. It was a military stalemate, and the U.S. Navy had to be assisted by hundreds of privateers. Now, we're just going to look at a couple of the highlights of the actual battles of the War of 1812, and it was right upon declaring war against the British that the war hawks came up with this slogan, "On to Canada," and they made it a reality. With forces outnumbering the British almost 35-1, they expected a quick and an easy victory, and an end to the British in the New World and this vast new landholding for the United States. American tactics, with a division of its forces into segments at Detroit, Niagara, and Lake Champlain, were idiotic at best, and they were disastrous in application. The British-Canadian forces under the capable command of General Isaac Brock stayed back and concentrated on defenses that the divided American troops could not overwhelm. The Americans were unable to break British Canada's chain of supply or to dent its defenses, and after repelling the American invasion, Brock pushed the fighting onto American territory. On August 15th, his forces captured Detroit, which was a key to control of the Great Lakes region. On October 13th, American troops made a second attempt at Canada that resulted in the Battle of Queenstown Heights, and the British forces under Brock once again pushed back the Americans, though Brock himself lost his life. On August 19th, when the land war was going terribly, the USS Constitution, commanded by Isaac Hull, routed and captured the British frigate Guerriere. Besides raising American morale, the battle created an American legend because a cannonball shot from the Guerriere bounced off the side of the Oak Constitution, and the ship forevermore owned the nickname Old Ironsides. In fact, there is a poem written about this by Oliver Wendell Holmes. The victory of the Constitution set a trend throughout 1812. The heavily gunned American ships consistently mastered the more lightly armed British vessels with which they came into conflict. And in addition, American privateers privately owned ships endorsed by the government to act as pirates, successfully harassed British trading vessels. By the year 1813, British forces, now under General Proctor, continued to hold off the inexperienced American armies. William Henry Harrison pushed northward out of Kentucky to try to retake Detroit, and he spent the winter of 1812 in Ohio maneuvering in opposition to General Proctor's forces. Meanwhile, a young U.S. naval officer named Oliver Hazard Perry, only 28 at the time, took over the American effort to retake the Great Lakes, and Perry arrived and quickly energized the construction of a 10-boat fleet on Lake Erie. On September 9, 1813, on Lake Erie, Perry's freshly built ships, with their inexperienced crew, challenged British Commander Barclay's smaller but more experienced fleet, and all of Barclay's officers died during the battle, and the British fleet was forced to surrender. Perry's victories on Lake Erie created a strategic nightmare for General Proctor and his men. He retreated to Niagara, and William Henry Harrison followed after him, catching Proctor's forces in early October at the Thames River. In the ensuing Battle of the Thames, the Americans defeated the British and their Indian allies, and during the battle, this is when the Indian leader Tecumseh was killed, along with his most committed allies. And Tecumseh's Indian Confederation, which had been allied to the British, very quickly collapsed after this. The United States wanted to follow William Henry Harrison's victory with an all-out assault against Montreal. Two American contingents, one marching from Sackett's Harbor on Lake Ontario and one from Plattsburgh, were to converge at Montreal. Each set out in mid-October. The advance guard of the men from Sackett's Harbor, led by Major General James Wilkinson, met with an embarrassing loss to a much smaller force of 800 British. Major General Wade Hampton, the commander of the Americans from Plattsburgh, immediately stopped his advance on hearing of his comrades' loss. Both contingents very quickly withdrew after this, leaving Britain unthreatened in Canada and once more pushing southward into New York. In early 1814, at the Battle of Leipzig, the European allies, including Britain, defeated Napoleon, and they exiled him to the island of Elba. With Napoleon gone, Britain suddenly had more resources available to continue the war against the U.S., and the British plans became much more ambitious, involving 3 separate initiatives: an invasion of New York, an attack against the Middle States, and an attack against New Orleans, designed in part to usurp control of the Mississippi. The United States, meanwhile, angered and embarrassed at its myriad failures on land, reorganized its army. The government promoted younger men who had served with recent distinction to the rank Major General. These new Major Generals included Andrew Jackson in the South and Jacob Brown in western New York. Free now to concentrate on the United States, Britain began to send veteran reinforcements into Canada. The war in the North no longer represented an American attempt at conquest, but rather a fight for American survival. In early July, American troops under Brown captured Fort Erie, and soon after, in a skirmish near Niagara Falls, American troops very soundly beat a brigade of British veterans. 3 weeks later, Brown's troops met another brigade of British reinforcements in the Battle of Lundy Lane. The battle ended in a bloody standoff, the bloodiest of the War of 1812, and in August the British moved against Fort Erie. The Americans held, inflicting serious losses on the British. The British attacks were really prelude to a larger invasion, with almost 15,000 men primed and waiting in Montreal. Having learned from the calamity of the Battle of Saratoga in the Revolutionary War, the British decided to build a water-based supply line. Control of Lake Champlain, a lake on the New York border just south of the Canadian border, was key in maintaining this British supply line. So the British built a flotilla of ships to wrest the lake from the American ships patrolling it. A small U.S. squadron of ships held the lake, none of them as heavily armed as the British ships. And to offset British firepower, Thomas MacDonough came up with a trick, installing cables along with his anchor that would allow him to quickly spin his boat and present the enemy with a fresh broadside. On September 11th, the same day Admiral Cochrane brought his fleet into Chesapeake Bay before bombing Baltimore, the British entered Lake Champlain from the Plattsburgh River. MacDonough was anchored across from the mouth, and the British attacked. After almost 6 hours fighting was fierce, though the British seemed to have the advantage, and MacDonough sprung his trap and opened fire from his pristine broadside, blasting the British flagship Confiance and killing the British captain, and the British retreated. With no supply line in place, the British invasion of New York never materialized. Despite American efforts, as the British turned their attention away from Europe to the war effort against the United States, British sea power asserted itself. Using this new source of strength, on August 18th of 1814, a force of about 4,000 redcoats landed in the Chesapeake Bay en route to Washington. The American General William Winder knew the British were en route to Washington, which could be approached from Maryland via one of 2 bridges. Winder burned one bridge and stationed men at the other to blow it up if the British approached. The British, seeing the telltale blaze of a night fire, figured that the bridge they wanted to use was destroyed, and decided to ford the river at Bladensburg. Winder quickly ordered his men there, where they were quickly routed at the Battle of Bladensburg. Washington evacuated as quickly as possible, and fleeing Americans destroyed the Navy Yard in D.C., hoping to deprive the British of any armaments that they could find there. When the British, having rested in the midday heat, finally entered the city, they found that D.C. had been abandoned. So the British looted and burned government buildings, including both the White House and the Capitol building. British Major General Robert Ross saw to it, however, that private residences were spared, and President Madison and his cabinet fled to set up a government in exile. During the evacuation of Washington, D.C., Dolly Madison's presence of mind saved many early treasures of the United States. Notable among these was Washington's portrait that you can see here above, painted by Gilbert Stuart. Because the frame was so solidly bolted to the wall that neither Dolly nor any of her assistants could unscrew it, they were forced to cut the canvas out of the frame. And Dolly, knowing the White House would soon be destroyed, set out the best wine in the cellar on ice for any thirsty soldiers that might come by. After Dolly left, Madison, returning from Bladensburg, stopped to rest in the White House, where he chatted with fleeing American soldiers who had stopped to quench their thirst with some presidential wine. And later that day, when the heat-exhausted British finally entered the White House, they too partook of Dolly's chilled wine before burning the White House to the ground. With Washington ablaze, British Admiral Thomas Cochrane now planned an invasion of Baltimore. And Baltimore, at this point, was committed to not falling as easily as Washington had, and the citizens of Baltimore formed a committee of vigilance and safety to prepare for the British attack. The city unified command of its forces under Major General Samuel Smith, and Smith worked tirelessly to prepare Baltimore for a strong defense. For instance, he managed to divert 5 huge artillery guns that were supposed to be shipped to Washington, and he used them to defend Fort McHenry, which protected Baltimore's harbor. Now, on September 11th of 1814, the British ships arrived in Baltimore during Sunday church services, and as the British infantry from Washington advanced on Baltimore, British Major General Robert Ross was killed by small arms fire. With Ross dead, his forces stalled, and Cochrane, sitting outside of Baltimore's harbor, grew impatient at the delay. At around 7 p.m., he began the naval bombardment of Fort McHenry, and under constant bombardment, American gunners found that their smaller guns didn't have a sufficient range to hit the British ships. The guns and powder were ordered well inside the safety of the fort, where the gunners and the material weathered the British attack. Having heard no shots from Fort McHenry, the British assumed the Americans had run out of ammunition, and they sailed in closer. And this was their big mistake. Fort McHenry's guns suddenly opened fire, and they decimated Cochrane's fleet and forced the British to retreat to Jamaica. And once there, Cochrane prepared to attack New Orleans. It was as the British sailed on Fort McHenry during this battle that Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment of Baltimore as a prisoner aboard a British ship, and during this time he composed the Star-Spangled Banner and describes within the song the battle and how the American flag stood throughout the night. In New England, which was the stronghold of the Federalist Party, people were really discontented throughout the war. Even after the victory in Baltimore had electrified the rest of the nation, some New England Federalists went so far as to argue for secession from the nation, in which New England would separately establish a peace with Britain, whether the rest of the country wanted to or not, and rumors abounded across the nation that some upset Federalists were even tipping off British cruisers about U.S. ships that were trying to run the British naval blockade. In late 1814, the New England Federalists began the most formal expression of their dissatisfaction with the war by beginning the Hartford Convention. At this time, even though the battle for Baltimore had been won, it still seemed possible that Britain could win the war, or at least that the war might go on a while longer. So Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont all sent delegates to Hartford, where they met in secret for 3 weeks. Around the country, many took the meeting of the Hartford Convention to mean that New England was preparing to secede from the Union, and some of the delegates were in fact very radical. John Lowell and Timothy Pickering, for instance, at least wanted to use the threat of secession to get their way, but most delegates were more moderate, like Harrison Gray Otis, who feared that all the talk of secession might lead to civil war. After deliberating for 3 weeks, the Hartford Convention's final demands were really quite moderate. The convention asked for the federal government to supply financial aid to help New England's trade economy, and for a new constitutional amendment which required a 2/3 majority rather than a simple 51% majority in order for embargoes to be imposed or war to be declared. The members of the Hartford Convention sent messengers with their demands to burned out Washington. Arriving at the same time as the news of Andrew Jackson's victory in New Orleans, the messengers were paid very little attention because the city was celebrating wildly at that point, and most people laughed at the messengers of the Hartford Convention. Others looked at them as dangerous secessionists, and the Hartford Convention, despite moderate demands, had made the Federalist Party look suspicious, and after the convention the party would rapidly decline. From 1812 to 1814, Tsar Alexander I of Russia was facing the threat of Napoleon's invasion on Russian soil. Alexander had no idea how much longer Napoleon would last, and he was unsure of his ability to hold out against the French emperor. As a result, Alexander did not want Britain distracted fighting a far-off war against the United States, and instead he wanted Britain focused on helping him fight Napoleon. The Russians had already defeated Napoleon, however, by the time they finally convinced Britain and the United States to come to the negotiating table in the Belgian city of Ghent in August of 1814. John Quincy Adams led the U.S. delegation, which also included famous men like Henry Clay and Albert Gallatin. By 1814, Britain's top negotiator, the Viscount Castlereagh, was too busy with the Congress of Vienna to attend negotiations in Ghent, so he sent lesser diplomats to represent Britain. And when Britain actually began the negotiations, they had recently wiped out the American army at Bladensburg, so they were hopeful about the prospects of a planned invasion of New York, and they were angry about continued American privateering. And so the British negotiators demanded advantageous terms, more territory for Canada, for example, including a large chunk of Maine, which the British Army now occupied anyway. They wanted control of the Great Lakes and the creation of a neutral Indian state to act as a buffer between the U.S. and Canada. But the U.S. negotiators refused the terms, and the Ghent negotiations seemed in vain when suddenly the tide of the war turned, and the U.S. won the battles of Baltimore and Lake Champlain. With the war now at a stalemate, on Christmas Eve in 1814, two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent. The treaty returned U.S.-British relations to the status they had had before the war. Neither side gained or lost territory. Issues like the orders in council and impressment were never addressed in the treaty, and in the 11 articles of the treaty, no mention was made of free trade, and no mention was made of sailors' rights. Albert Gallatin, who had been instructed to secure an end to impressment, wrote back to Madison that Britain's navy being what it was, they would never agree to this. The Americans decided to that the return of the status quo was enough, and news of the Treaty of Ghent took a while to reach the United States, and it was as a result of the fact that this news was so slow coming back to the U.S. that Andrew Jackson's men fought the most successful American battle during the War of 1812, which was the Battle of New Orleans, and they fought it unnecessarily because we had already reached a peace treaty. So if we go back to the British defeat at the Battle of Baltimore in late 1814, it was after this that the British Admiral Thomas Cochrane was finally ready for an attack on New Orleans. For the United States, Andrew Jackson was already a hero of campaigns against the Creek Indians, and he was placed in command of the Southern forces. Jackson commanded this ragtag group of soldiers who were neither particularly experienced nor very organized. Also among his charges were 2 regiments of black volunteers from the New Orleans area. After Robert Ross's death in the invasion of Baltimore, Major General Edward Pakenham was put in command of the British ground forces in the New Orleans invasion, and it would take him some time to arrive from Britain, and as a result, very poor leadership and inadequate preparation plagued the British ground forces during this battle. While the British prepared their invasion, Jackson was busy finishing up a campaign against the Creek Indians in the south, as he was also hoping to take Spain's city of Pensacola in Florida. And furthermore, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols of Britain was engaged in some minor maneuvers in Florida, but it was probably just a diversion. And Jackson was so obsessed with Florida that he allowed Nichols' movements with a tiny force to distract him from preparing for the massive attack on New Orleans. Instead of marching his men to New Orleans right away, Jackson remained in the Pensacola area, sending his men on all kinds of wasteful operations. And even when he was directly ordered by his superiors to march his troops to New Orleans, he still dallied in Pensacola for quite a while, convinced that Britain had secret designs on Florida. Finally, on November 12th of 1814, Jackson, having been completely fooled by British misdirection, realized it was time to march his men to New Orleans. Andrew Jackson set up his men and his fleet in what he believed would allow him to challenge the British amphibious landing. He miscalculated, though, and Cochrane decided to press through the small American fleet on Lake Borgne in order to land the Redcoats so they would have a route to New Orleans along a path Jackson had not defended. So the U.S. fleet on Lake Borgne stood no chance and was immediately wiped out by the British, and Jackson very quickly moved the U.S. troops to New Orleans. Cochrane, for his part, had trouble finding good landing ground, a process that took into December of 1814, and once he landed, the British attempted an initial surprise attack, and Jackson's men repelled them, and Cochrane fell back to wait for General Pakenham and to plan a full assault. When Pakenham arrived on Christmas Day, a day after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, Jackson's army busied itself building earthwork defenses, largely using local slave labor that was supposedly volunteered by the slave masters. On January 8th of 1815, Pakenham ordered an attack at 6 in the morning. Expecting another Bladensburg, the British forces made a frontal assault on Jackson's ragtag army. Under Jackson, the American forces didn't run, though, and the British army was soundly defeated. So if we look at the results of the War of 1812, and we remember that the Treaty of Ghent in no way addressed the causes of the war, it didn't say anything about impressment, and it didn't say anything at all about fair trade or any kind of trade agreements. But what does happen as a result of the war is that the United States gains a level of respect from foreign countries, and also this war marks the end of U.S. involvement in European affairs for about the next century. It's a period of political isolationism that allows the growth of the nation without any kind of interfering warfare. And the Monroe Doctrine is actually the foreign policy of President Monroe beginning in 1823, and it says that further efforts by European nations to colonize land or to interfere with states in the North or South America would be viewed as acts of aggression that required the United States to intervene. But the most important part of this doctrine notes that the United States will neither interfere with existing European colonies nor meddle in the internal concerns of European countries. And we will talk more about the Monroe Doctrine in our next lecture on the era of good feelings. The War of 1812 also sparks this surge in an increased sense of nationalism, a kind of civic pride, and American writers emerge as a result of this. People like Washington Irving, who wrote Rumpelstiltskin and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and also writer James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Last of the Mohicans and Leatherstocking Tales. And what's different about these pieces is that these are stories of fiction that are set in America, and unlike pieces like Common Sense, these aren't just political writings. The war also paved the way for a new surge of Western migration, and you've probably heard the term manifest destiny before. It's in the 19th century that people increasingly believe that Americans have a moral duty and a religious duty to spread from coast to coast and to civilize the indigenous people that they meet along the way, as well as to civilize the wilderness and build it up. And William Henry Harrison is going to defeat the Native Americans in the Northwest, and Andrew Jackson will defeat the natives in the Southwest, which will actually eventually play a large part in his winning the presidency. Inadvertently, the War of 1812 stimulated American industry. It also created a national sense of self-sufficiency because during wartime, Americans had to make their own supplies, especially because trade was cut off with the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. And of course, during wartime, trade was certainly cut off as well. So these Americans had to rely upon themselves, and they lost their reliance on foreign countries. The War of 1812 lastly led to the total collapse of the Federalist Party, who had from the very beginning opposed the war. And at this point, there was only one political party, the Democratic Republicans. When James Monroe runs for office after Madison leaves, you'll see that he actually runs without any particular political party going against him. And throughout his presidency and the presidency of John Quincy Adams, we call this the era of good feelings. There's really a dying down of this sort of political partisanship and the bickering between parties. And then over time, when we get into the presidency of Andrew Jackson, we will see a shift in political parties. You'll see that the Democratic Republicans become simply Democrats under Jackson, and then the old Federalist Party kind of resurges into a new Whig party.